I always thought that PTSD and flashbacks were something only war veterans dealt with, gunfire or the sound of helicopters, until I learned about complex PTSD and the emotional flashbacks that can come with it. And suddenly it was describing me and my exact experience. Learning about emotional flashbacks completely transformed the way I see my emotional reactions and how I deal with them. I'm Nicola, and I've been releasing my issues for the last 25 years, ever since I threw my parents out of my house for violating my boundaries once too often. So I'm going to share with you what I've learned about emotional flashbacks, what they are, where they come from, how to manage them, and how to resolve them, so that you can start to manage your feelings better and start healing childhood trauma. This information is inspired by Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving. And I bought this book years ago, but I avoided reading it because I didn't like the label of PTSD. But I wish now that I'd read it sooner, because it has been incredibly helpful in recognizing and recovering from complex PTSD. And I'll link to his book below if you want to read further on this topic, and I really recommend that you do. So what is an emotional flashback? An emotional flashback is one of the main effects of complex PTSD. And PTSD is often caused by childhood trauma, which comes from often parental abuse or neglect. And this can be physical or sexual, but it can also be verbal and emotional. And when we're having a flashback, we are regressing to those intense emotions of childhood. We are going back to those experiences, and they're primarily not visual experiences. We're not remembering things, we're not seeing things, we are feeling things really intensely. And these overwhelming feelings seem to come out of nowhere. They just appear and take us over in the moment. And they can trigger our fight or flight response. They're so intense. We might feel things like fear or rage or shame or guilt or grief or depression, but these intense emotions take us over. And these moments of emotional flashback can be subtle, or they can be really severe, and they might last for a few moments, or they might last for days or weeks or months. There's huge variation in the form that these emotional flashbacks can take. Over the years, I've learned to recognize some of my emotional flashbacks. I remember back in 2008, we were in a lot of financial strain. A lot of things were going on, and I remember feeling every day like I was just soaked in fear. I spent every moment of every day feeling like something terrible was about to happen, and just being overwhelmed by these intense, painful emotions that I wanted nothing more than to escape from. They were too painful, too intense. I just wanted out. I could not deal with these feelings. And more recently, I've recognized that when I put a deadline on myself and I rush, I put pressure on myself, and then things don't work out, things take longer than I'd like them to, I flip into this mode where I am basically pushing myself really hard, feeling panicky, like I don't have enough time to get everything done, and I'm just over-revved. Everything's just running on adrenaline, and that's another kind of emotional flashback that I've experienced. And a third one that my husband and I have been working on throughout our relationship is his tendency that when I raise things, either that I'm providing feedback on, or I would like to change, or expressing my needs, that a lot of the time he will feel attacked by those things. And in feeling attacked, it triggers an emotional reaction, a flashback for him, where he feels inadequate, and it shuts him down, and the conversation is unable to be constructive at that point. And so by recognizing these different forms that emotional flashbacks can take, we can start to understand what they are and how they affect our everyday lives. So what are some of the signs that we're in an emotional flashback? Well, as I've mentioned, the main one is these really intense feelings that we're feeling, often that seem to come out of nowhere, and that often seem somewhat out of proportion to what just happened. Yes, they might feel justified in the moment, but on reflection, they're a little bit over the top compared to the events that led up to them. So that over the top, intense emotional experience is our first sign that we're having a flashback. In addition to this, when we're having these overwhelming feelings, this can lead to dysregulation. This intense experience can push us outside of our ability to cope. And so our emotions become dysregulated, our nervous system becomes dysregulated. And so we go into hyperarousal, where we're overreactive, or hypoarousal, where we're underreactive. And I've got a whole video that takes you through this concept of the window of tolerance that can help you understand this even more. But what you might be feeling are things like fear, so anxiety or panic or a need to escape, or despair, feeling numbness or paralysis, or a desire to hide. The other thing that I've noticed in my own experience is a compulsive need to get rid of these feelings because these feelings are so intense and so painful. When I have these flashbacks, often I'll notice myself doing things to try and get rid of those feelings in any way possible. One of the things I often do is eat. I try and eat in order to soothe myself. I'm trying soothing techniques, and eating is my go-to. It doesn't necessarily work most of the time. Most of the time, eating doesn't actually change anything, but I can sense that what I'm trying to do is get rid of these feelings. And I'll do other things like watching TV or playing games or burying myself in the computer in order to get myself into my mind and out of my body and out of these really intense experiences that I don't want to feel. Another sign that you're in an emotional flashback is that you are behaving in a way that is not like you. You're out of character. You are doing things that don't feel like you. I know sometimes I'll find myself saying or doing things I don't really want to say or do, but in the moment, that's what comes out. And so when you notice yourself doing these behaviors that seem out of character, that's another sign that you are having a flashback. And of course, when you are in that flashback, you often will feel unsafe and helpless and powerless and small and like that 5-year-old child that is back feeling completely incapable of doing anything about this situation that's unfolding. And another sign that you're in emotional flashback is toxic shame. So we bury ourselves in self-loathing. We look at everything that's wrong with us and we hate ourselves to the core. And when we're in that toxic shame of feeling like we are completely worthless, we are very critical of ourselves and we hate ourselves, and it's just a really unpleasant place to be. But that's a sign that we're actually in a flashback. And at the same time as that, what tends to happen is that our inner critic will jump in. It will take the opportunity to jump in and add to the negative self-talk, to reiterate all the things that are wrong with us. The negative self-talk, the polarized black and white thinking, the judgmental behavior, looking at ourselves judgmentally, but also looking at other people judgmentally, looking at the outside world and criticizing them can be another sign that we're in the middle of an emotional flashback. So learning to recognize these signs is really important because then it helps us figure out, okay, what triggers us and then what can we do about that? So what are some of the things that can trigger an emotional flashback? Well, usually what happens is that these triggers are unconscious. They happen without us even being aware of it. And before we know it, we're in the middle of emotional flashback, feeling those intense feelings. And so it's some kind of stimulus coming either from the outside or internally that activates this reaction, that brings us back to this state of intense emotion. So being mindful about what's going on for us can be really helpful with this. And I found that meditation is a great way to develop mindfulness. And I've got a guide with step-by-step instructions of some of the most common meditation techniques you might find helpful as you work to develop this mindfulness so you can be more aware of when you are being triggered by something. But these triggers can be external. They can be things like people you run into, places you go to, scenarios, specific combinations of events. It might be a word that someone uses, a tone of voice they use, or a facial expression is a really common one. I think a lot of people are familiar with the experience of the look. There was a certain look that they got from their parents, and if they have an experience of that now, even if it slightly resembles it from someone completely different, it can be enough to send them into one of those emotional flashbacks. And these stimulus can be pretty subtle and seemingly harmless. Things like making a mistake or having to ask for help or speaking in public or feeling hungry or tired or lonely or being in physical pain, having to deal with authority figures or being vulnerable. I remember on many occasions where I have opened up myself in conversations with close friends where at the time it felt appropriate to share those things that I wouldn't normally share. But that being vulnerable triggers me after the conversation has ended into an emotional flashback where I am feeling unsafe. That vulnerability leads me to feel unsafe. And I rehash that conversation and I feel like something terrible is going to happen because I opened up and was vulnerable in that conversation. But triggers can also come internally, so they can be simply your inner critic piping up just at the wrong moment to give you a negative view on something, and that can turn you into a spiral of negative self-talk and trigger this emotional flashback. It can be visualizing things, worrying about what's going on, anticipating that you're about to make a mistake. Any kind of this negative noticing behavior can be enough to trigger into you one of these emotional flashbacks. So what do you do when you realize you're in the middle of an emotional flashback? Well, Pete Walker shares in his book a 13-step process that I found really helpful, and I go back to when I find myself in the middle of a flashback. The first step of this process is to recognize that you are in the middle of a flashback. And so looking at those signs and symptoms of being in a flashback helps you to pick out when it's happening to you. And when you recognize it, to say to yourself, I am having a flashback. And so this is just really useful at anchoring you, okay, I know what's going on with me right now, and feeling empowered because you know what's going on and you can do something about it. And I've got a video that takes you through ways to develop your self-awareness even further that you might find helpful as you work to recognize that you are in the middle of an emotional flashback. The second step is to reassure yourself and to say something like, I feel afraid, but I am not in danger. Now, I used this process the other day when I was in the middle of one of my panicky rush emotional flashbacks. And I was able to say the words, I feel afraid, but I could not say, but I'm not in danger. There was a part of my brain that would not acknowledge that. It felt to my body 100% that I was completely in danger and I was unable to vocalize, but I'm not in danger. But when we say this, we're trying to tell our systems that we are okay, that everything is safe, that it's okay, we can settle down and we'll be all right. So the next step is to recognize that you're allowed to have boundaries, that you are allowed to say, this isn't working for me, I need to get out of this situation, to have rules about what you're willing to accept into your experience. And if you still struggle with boundaries, I've got a step-by-step guide that might help you with that. But I know that's something I struggle with, and reminding myself, but I have the right to say no or to step away is really important in these situations. It's also really important to reassure our inner child. So buried inside of us is a version of us that is still 5 years old and dealing with this horrible experience that led to this trigger in the first place, that created this emotional intensity that we're now flashing back to. So we need to reassure that inner child that they are safe, that everything's going to be okay. We also need to stop thinking in terms of forever. It's easy to slip into the idea when we're having this emotional flashback that this is going to last forever, that this is something that will never end. It feels so intense, so painful, and it feels like we will never get out of this. But we need to remind ourselves in that moment that this will end. This too shall pass. We know that we've been in a place where we weren't flashing back and we can get there again. We also need to remember that we are an adult. In this moment, we are not a 5-year-old child. We are not back at the behest of our parents. We are an adult. We have experiences and skills and resources that we can call on to help us deal with what's going on for us. We also really need to get back into our bodies, because when we have these experiences, I know for myself, my instinct is to get away from them as fast as possible, and that means going into my head and staying out of my body and not feeling what's going on. So we need to find ways to get back into our body. We need to relax. We need to breathe. We need to slow down. We need to feel safe in whatever way we can. And as much as possible, we want to actually feel those emotions. We need to show ourselves that we are capable of feeling those emotions without dying, without whatever terrible thing happening that we're afraid of will happen. And by feeling those emotions and being able to sit with them, we will actually lose some of the intensity of those emotions, because our body learns that it's actually okay to feel those feelings. And I've got a step-by-step guide with tons of ideas on how you can ground yourself and bring yourself back into the present moment to be in the here and now and really feel what's going on for you that you might want to download. The next thing you need to do is to resist the inner critic, because what tends to happen when we're in these flashbacks is the inner critic uses the opportunity to pipe up and just throw extra negativity into the mix. And we need to recognize that negative voice as it starts to try and wear us down even more, and resist it, to push back against those messages, to acknowledge it, but not buy into the things it's trying to tell us in that moment. And we also need to allow ourselves to grieve in that moment, to recognize that there were things that happened to us that weren't great, that led to us having this flashback right here, right now, and to go through a process of grieving whether that is getting angry about what happened or crying about what happened, finding healthy ways to grieve through those experiences so that we can acknowledge, accept, and process them more effectively. And we also need to get support. We need to work with the people around us so that they can provide some of what we need to help us process these flashbacks, whether that's friends or family or a trusted professional, someone who makes us feel safe, who understands what's going on for us, and where possible can help us work through the process, even if that's simply just saying, here's the list of 13 things to do. This might help. Just having people around us and that support can help us manage our flashbacks more effectively. And as we practice this, we also need to start thinking about what triggered us. What was it that led to this flashback? What triggered this intense emotional reaction I'm having right now? Understanding the events that led up to this can be really helpful with that. And then once we understand the triggers, we can work to either remove those triggers, avoid those triggers, or minimize them, or simply just reduce how much they affect us. But that knowledge of the triggers can be really powerful. And I've got a whole video that talks you through spotting your different triggers that you might find helpful as well. What we also need to do, though, is identify the source. Where did this come from? We understand the trigger that led up to this, but now what was the experience in our childhood that created this emotional flashback situation? What was the intense experience at the time that we weren't able to process, that we felt helpless to do anything about, that we are now reliving in this moment? And by understanding that, we can discover these wounds from our past and start to actually heal and work through them. And the last and really important step is to have patience with yourself, because as you work through this, it's messy, it's not neat and tidy, it's not always going to be a perfect sequence of events, it's not always going to work the way you want. You will say and do things that are out of character, or you will feel things that are terrible, you will think things that are terrible. And to have patience with yourself and to be as kind as possible to yourself as you work through this entire process. And I will link to Pete's download that he offers with these 13 steps laid out to help you work through this process so that you can manage your flashbacks more effectively. It's also really important to understand that sometimes these emotional flashbacks can be misdiagnosed as other conditions. Now, that's not to say these other things aren't happening at the same time, but it's important to understand the concept of emotional flashback and how it can overlay with these things. You might have been diagnosed with things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, OCD, panic disorder. These kinds of things can be confused or muddied in with emotional flashbacks. So learning to understand, manage, and resolve your flashbacks more effectively can actually contribute to resolving some of these other things, or at least reducing how severely they impact you. So now you understand what an emotional flashback is and how it affects you, where they come from, what causes it, and most importantly, what you can do about it so you can get back to being yourself more quickly. But in order to do that successfully, you're really going to have to develop your self-awareness. So watch this video next, and I'll see you in the next one.